We are ready for the next session. Is English really an Indian language? The session is surely going to be very, very interesting and informative. To begin the session, I would like to invite on stage Chairman of the session, Nirmal Kanti Bhattacharya, former Secretary of Sahitya Academy's Eastern Regional Office at Kolkata, Radha Chakravarti, who is famous for her translations of Rabindranath Tagore's works, author, columnist, Meenakshi Madhavan Reddy, and Rakshanda Jalil, who is a writer, critic, translator, and literary historian. May I now request all the speakers and chairman to please join us on stage for this session. Nirmal Kanti Bhattacharya, Radha Chakravarti, Meenakshi Madhavan Reddy, and Rakshanda Jalil to please join us on stage. We are set for this new session. Is English really an Indian language? Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for the chairman and speakers of this session. May I request the chairman, Mr. Bhattacharya, to initiate the panel discussion, please.
Namaskar and good evening. This is the first business session of the Odisha Literary Festival. And I'm very happy that we have three co-panelists who are scholars by their own right, literary historians, translators, and who have handled English as a language with superb command. I would have preferred them to be introduced here from this forum, but because of the paucity of time, I have been advised that since the handout has been given to all of you, the brochure which contains the details of the achievements of the speakers, so we need not dwell upon that. Topic of our session today is English an Indian language? So at the very beginning, I would like to alert you a little that though the topic sounds like a debate topic, none of the panelists here, neither me, are geared up to say a yes or a no. It's not a debating society, and we are not taking an extreme position right away. We shall try to discuss the different ramifications of this topic. We shall try to find out the position of English today in India. And in discussing this, maybe some hints, some suggestions will be there, whether we should treat it as an Indian language or whether we have already been treating it as an Indian language, ipso facto, whether willy-nilly we are already treating it as an Indian language. Let me begin with a news item, which I'll just introduce the topic briefly, before I invite my panelists to speak. I would like to begin with a news item which I came across a few days back somewhere. It says that a young Dalit man in a place called Banka in Uttar Pradesh has built, he is a sort of a sculptor, and he has built a statue of a goddess called English. Styled after the Statue of Liberty, this statue has a torch on its raised hand and a book on the other hand. And this young Dalit man claims that it is only through the learning of English that they can shake off their century-old suppression and subjugation. He believes that worshipping the goddess English, they can earn dignity and respectability in the society. This news item may evoke a smile of derision in many of us. But if one pauses to think, one might find some kind of, question of language and identity, and how the question of language and identity is related with the material distribution of wealth, and how ultimately the language and identity may lead to safety and prosperity. All these larger questions of life are involved here. I would also like to point out here, and also for the kind notice of my panelist friends here, that perhaps we can also address the issue of ownership of English internationally today. The central question to be addressed is, does English remain within the hands of the white native speaker of standard English, or does it belong to whoever speaks it anywhere in the world, irrespective of the linguistic and socio-cultural history? I think that is one important question which this question may further lead to. But first thing first, let us look at the official position of the state of India. Technically and officially speaking, English is not an Indian language. It has not been included in the 8th schedule of the Constitution, which began with 13 languages and gradually added more languages, and now it has come up to 24. But English is not there. The Constitution gives English the status of a linked language, which is to remain there for 15 years as a linked language, and eventually to be replaced by Hindi. Now, what would have happened after 15 years? What would have been the fate of English after 15 years if that exercise had succeeded? Constitution is silent about it. But interestingly, that tricky situation never arose, because even after 70 years of independence, English still remains as the linked language, and Hindi has not been able to replace it yet. There is an interesting sidelight to this rather dichotomous position taken by the state. The apex body of literature under the Government of India, Sahitya Akademi, every year gives away an award in English at par with other Indian languages. So in a manner of speaking, does it not mean that government is recognizing English also as an Indian language? However, if we look at the, at the non-state players, to use a political cliche, if we look at the private organizations, then what do we see? We find the Gyanpith Foundation, which gives away Gyanpith award, arguably the highest literary award of the country, often called the Nobel Prize of India, does not include English. The second major pan-Indian literary award, Saraswati Samman of K.K. Birla Foundation, also keeps English out of its ambit. These awards are, for only the Indian languages. So in terms of their definition, English is not an Indian language. Whereas in terms of Sahitya Akademi's definition, English is an Indian language. But whereas in terms of Constitution, again, English is not an Indian language. So I believe, some kind of confusion, some kind of dichotomy in attitude continues even after 70 years of independence. Now, if we look at the real position, we would find that we cannot really do without English. And every day, as the language of opportunity, English is commanding more and more respect, and English's role has become all the more important day by day. As a link language also, anywhere you go in the country. Recently I was in some remote places of Ladakh also, and there also I find the language of communication. I could communicate not much in Hindi with them, but in English, maybe some broken English, maybe an Indian English. So these are certain issues we have to keep in mind while discussing the topic. One is also aware of the phenomenal rise of Indian English literature in our country. There are endless debates about about regional literature versus English literature. All these bickerings about the opportunities are being all grabbed by the English literature, and regional literature is only a poor cousin, kind of no media, nothing. But despite the fact, the English literature in our country has developed phenomenally, and the whole world has set up and taken note of it. But try to remember some 30 years, even some 30, 40 years back also, those who started writing in English were often criticized for abandoning their mother tongue, for abandoning their regional language, as if it is a betrayal of the cause of nationalism. And some 75 years back, when Raja Rao's Kanthapura was published, I suppose in 1938, that wonderful introduction which Raja Rao wrote, there also he mentioned that though we use the word alien tongue in connection with English, but English is not exactly an alien tongue for us. English is the language of our intellectual growth. And in that wonderful introduction, Raja Rao suggested that we should not write like the English. We cannot write like the English. We should write like an Indian. And eventually, we should evolve a language like the Irish or like the American, which will be an English dialect written and spoken in India. And then, of course, he ended the introduction by saying that time will only justify it. Now, it remains to be seen whether time has justified it. With this introducing remarks, I would request the panelists to start the discussion. Now, I have three ladies, I'm a little nervous sitting, sandwiched between three wonderful ladies. And one has to begin from a corner, or one has to, I think I'll begin with Rakshanda, Dr. Rakshanda Jalil, a literary historian, a translator, a fiction writer. And Rakshanda has written and talked about the position of English with reference to our literary history. And she has also deliberated a lot about how translation, both Rakshanda and Radha Chakraborty also, how translation in English can actually help in the concept of Indian literature. Because there was a time when there was no Indian literature. It was Odia literature, Bengali literature, Tamil literature, Marathi literature. It is through a lot of translations into English and Hindi that a kind of home library has been created. And we have started thinking that perhaps there is something called really Indian literature. So I would request Lakshanda to kindly begin the speech. You can speak.
I'll speak from here. Please. Now, regrettably, I have no grand theories. A topic such as this ideally should be bolstered with facts and figures and grand theories. I don't have those. Instead, I think what I'd like to do is share my own experience. For the past 25 odd years that I have been a writer, been using English in the public domain, and I'd like to talk about that with you. I want to tweak Descartes and say, I write, therefore I am. While my mother tongue is Urdu, I speak Hindustani, which is a nice, sweet, shireen mixture of Hindi and Urdu for everyday purposes. Regrettably, I write only in English, and this, to my mind, is a pity. I wish my Urdu was good enough for me to write in. Regrettably, it is not. I wish my Hindi, which is quite good, was good enough. I wish I had the vocabulary to write in Hindi, but alas, I don't. I'm a victim, like many others, of this thing called English medium education. And therefore, for all practical purposes, for my idiom, my critical idiom, my language of discourse has become English. Now, the subject is such that we can very well make this distinction between spoken English and written English. Nirmalda, maybe we can touch upon that later as we go along in this conversation, but I'll, to begin with, confine my remarks about written English. I do different kinds of writing, and therefore the different kinds of writing that I do, as it were, makes me use English differently. I am by training a literary historian, which means I look at a context. I don't no longer look at a text. Incidentally, my work was on a literary movement in Urdu, and it was published in English. That says a great deal about publishing in India, about the kind of people who read this kind of work, and the fact that there are enough people wanting to know about, well, I wouldn't say obscure, but a lesser known literary movement in Urdu, but they want to read about it in English. This, to my mind, says something. So the kind of writing I do for, let's say, critical writings, I would use English in a different way. I would use, let's say, more standard English. I would use more acceptable English. The other kind of writing that I have done is fiction writing, where I can afford to be more idiosyncratic, more whimsical, more individualistic. So naturally, there I would use English in a different way. The third kind of writing that I do, which incidentally forms the bulk of my writing, is the translations. And it is this third kind that really allows me to push language to its boundaries. Radha is here, and I'm sure in this session we are going to talk about translations some more. V.K. Karthika is sitting in this audience, and Karthika, in her stint in Penguin and in HarperCollins, is single-handedly responsible for making a space. And I think we need a shout-out for Karthika and for publishers in India right now. They have made a space for translations. In the mid-80s, when Penguin first started shop, before that, what did we have by way of translations? We had the Panchtantra, which we read in translation. We had translations of the Gita, which Jayco Press and others published. We had these shoddy little things that you bought from Wheeler and Company. But no mainstream publisher really was publishing translation. And with mainstream publishers, with people like Karthika making a space and giving us this space to bring in the kind of translations we wanted to bring and accepting those translations and publishing them, I think a new kind of writing is emerging. When I translate from Urdu and from Hindi, I increasingly, I published my first translation also with HarperCollins in '92. That was a collection of Prem Chand stories. From '92 to now, my use of English has changed. the same text that I translated in 92, a Premchand short story, I'm pretty certain I would translate very, very differently today. Now, why is that? I think we as translators, we as users of English have become more self-assured. We are saying that in our growing up years as students, we read a great deal of translations. Nobody made it easy or simple for us. We read the Russian masters, we read the French symbolists, we read Greek mythology in English translation. Nobody made it idiot-proof. Nobody gave it to us in bite-sized pieces. So as translators, today when we use language, we say, yes, I want to retain big parts of the language that I have translated from. It could be Phanishwar Nath Renu's Hindi in my case, or the novels and short stories of Intezar Hussain from Urdu, and I want to retain those flavors, those feelings, those symbols, those images. I don't want to make it facile, I don't want to make it flat. So, I think let's pick up these subjects as we go along, should we not? But let's talk some more about how translations have, in a sense, changed the use of English for us.
Yeah, thank you. But when at the beginning you were talking about Urdu and Hindi, did you sound a little apologetic that you are using English? I think it is very much connected with our topic.
I'm not apologetic, but I do wish that our education systems, I fortunately went to a school which had offered a third language. So from 6th, 7th, 8th, you could learn another language. But I was very rudimentary. I did learn Urdu there, but it was extremely rudimentary. I'm not apologetic, but I'm regretful. I regret the fact that I wish I knew these other languages that I read with ease. I wish I was able to write in them as well.
Thank you very much. That means, I think the question of, a very important question of our education system has come up. Whether English is an Indian language or not, that will be very largely determined by the educational policy which our state has been pursuing. I would request Madhavi, Meenakshi Madhavan, kindly to speak on this. And I have from your bioinformation, one finds that you have worked in various fields. So if you can throw some light on our education policy and the attitude of the language teachers and the language learners vis-a-vis English.
Thanks. Again, I'm going to talk a little bit of my experiences first. Unlike most people in this room or most people I know, English is my first, last, and only language. I know a little Hindi. I know enough to understand Telugu, but I'm pretty much unmoored. It's a sort of lonely feeling to be cut off from the rest of your country, especially because I don't like cricket very much and I don't drink tea. So, but also unlike most people I know, I grew up here. I never lived abroad. I never studied abroad. I'm a product of India in and out of itself. So when I see a topic like, is English really an Indian language, I feel like it's telling me, are you really an Indian person? Because this is the only language that you have. I tried to fix it. I mean, my parents are from different parts of the country, and so they spoke to me only in English, which is why this whole confusion came about, even though I had an ayah who tried, which is why I can speak more Telugu than I can Malayalam. And when the school I went to also put great emphasis on Indian languages, so we had Sanskrit and Hindi up to class 9, and we also encouraged to take a third Indian language, which was either Gujarati, Tamil, Bengali, or Urdu, and I opted for Tamil. But with years of falling out of practice, I'm confined to one. And a few months ago, I was at another Lit Fest, and I was talking to this other writer about what I was trying to do next, which is working on a version of the Mahabharata for teenagers. And he said, so what Indian language have you read the Mahabharata in? And I said, well, I've read it in English, the translations. And he said, you have no business writing about the Mahabharata unless you read it in Indian language. I said, well, I don't know any Indian languages. He said, then learn one enough to read it. And again, this isolating feeling, this what you are doesn't matter. It's not that I would not want to read or write in another Indian language besides Hindi, which I don't even know that well. it's just also sort of stubbornness within me. It's like, this is what I am now, so take it or leave it. And yeah, that's pretty much my opinion on the... What you were saying about educators. Growing up, there was always great value placed on vernaculars, probably because my father also writes in a vernacular language. So it was part of my, I mean, it wasn't unusual to see different scripts, and it wasn't something that you looked down upon in any way in my, where I was growing up.
Dr. Radha Chakraborty is a professor of comparative literature in Ambedkar University, and she has extensively translated, particularly Tagore, and she has also written on gender issues and other things. So she will definitely talk about what she wants to talk about, but I'll also like to ask her that in view of your background as an educationist, what do you think regarding the educational policy, regarding the 2-language formula, 3-language formula? Was there any attempt, any conscious attempt at any time by our national planners or nation builders to appropriate English into the Indian polity? Or it is just floating around just as a language of need and a language of opportunity?
Thank you. Yes, as someone who is the product of our education system, but someone who since the last several decades has been also involved in higher education, first as a teacher of English in Delhi University College, but now more recently as someone who is inventing curriculum in comparative literature and translation studies at Ambedkar University. I think this whole question of the place of English in our curriculum is something that has always haunted one's thoughts. And as Meenakshi said, and as Rakshanda said before me, in a sense, all of us are products of our circumstances. And we are products of an education system where, while we have always been aware of the vernacular languages, and while these languages have been on the periphery of our education, somehow it is to English that many of us have received major exposure during the formative years of our training. The same kind of hierarchy, I feel, prevails in the higher education system, at least where I come from. And I was teaching, for instance, in a college that offered honors in English, but also in Hindi, also in Sanskrit. But if we look at the cutoff percentages in the newspapers, the students with the highest marks would go for English, and for Hindi and Sanskrit, the same would not hold true, almost as if there was a prioritization. And this whole question of, is this only for practical reasons? Is it because English is the language of opportunity? To an extent, yes. But English is also perhaps perceived as a status symbol and a language that indicates social privilege. So it indicates more than linguistic attitudes. It's an indicator, an index of social attitudes that perhaps need to be rethought. And what we are doing now in our curriculum, in the new curriculum we are working with at Ambedkar University, is to question this kind of hierarchization by bringing down some of the walls that separate different languages within our education system, where you do an honors in either English or Hindi or Urdu or Punjabi, as the case may be. As someone who is talking comparative literature, our starting point is that our students should value the fact that we come from a multilingual society, and they should value the fact that most, I think, Indians have at least a smattering of at least 3 languages, even if they have their major training in only one. And this is evident in the kind of mixed language, the kind of Hinglish, for instance, that our students slide into the moment they walk out of the English classroom. the way they talk to each other in the canteen, the way they talk to people back home. So there is a mixing of languages, and there is a knowledge of languages that we are not tapping into because we don't value it. And I think the push will be in our newly designed curriculum to encourage students to value their language resources, to build on them, and to see these languages in a vital relationship with each other. To this purpose, translation, of course, serves a key role. And as someone who has been translating extensively, but also who has been editing volumes of South Asian writing translated from diverse languages of South Asia, I firmly believe that if translation were not so underrated within our culture, if the centrality of translation were to be valued more highly, then greater channels of communication between the languages would open up, and greater fluidity would happen that would break down some of the boundaries that exist in our current curriculum. Regarding this question of whether English is an Indian language or not, well, it's certainly not a language that came to India by growing naturally from Indian soil. It was imported into India, and it's interesting that English literature was taught in India before it was taught in Britain, and that it was introduced into India with a view to creating a class of intellectual elite subjects who would become anglicized, who would become receptive to the culture of the British, and who would therefore mediate between the British administration and the Indian masses. So the history of the introduction of English was perhaps inglorious, but having said that, I think what we have been hearing in the conversation so far is the way English has been Indianized, appropriated, claimed by Indians. Indian writing in English is booming today, and if we think of, for instance, Salman Rushdie's idea of chutnification of the English language, Indianizing English language, about which he says, mine is super sexy high masala art. And he presents this kind of dazzling blend of Indian languages blended into his own version of English. And we see this happening in other parts of the world, the way English has been appropriated in various places to which it had been transported from its mother country. And then this question of whether it's Indian or not, I think we have Indianized it. And if we are practical, then perhaps instead of saying that we should boycott English, the idea would be to see it as functional and instrumental, not just as a language of practical opportunity, but also as a way of making the world aware of the treasures of Indian literature in the various Indian languages.
So Radha thinks that this question is rather redundant because English has become a part of our life and we have Indianized it. So whether it is an Indian language or not, perhaps we need not unnecessarily waste our time on that. On the other hand, let us see some of the actual situation obtaining in the country so far as English is concerned. I will give you two examples. Most of the signboards in various states of India were in English earlier, signboards of shops and offices and all. And then some state governments or some organizations in certain states took up the cause that the signboards, why the signboards are in English? It should be in the language of the state. Fair enough. So language of the state was used in the signboards along with English below or Hindi below. But of late, one finds in some of these states, many of the signboards, even of government offices, are only in the language of the state. So if I am visiting a particular state, and let me not name any state, but I'm talking about a personal experience. I went to find out a particular address, which is a big public place. But since I do not know the language or do not know the script, I could not locate it. I was there, right there, almost in front of it. So I had to ask people and find out. So what kind of mindset is working here? Do we have a kind of, a kind of duality in our approach to English? On the one hand, we want English, we cannot do without English. On the other hand, we occasionally go for weird experiments. Let us remember in the 70s, the disastrous experiment done by the left-front government in West Bengal by totally removing English from the primary level, Up to class 6, there was no English. And as a result, the students started quite late learning English. And today, the historians and educationists are telling us that one whole generation of youth in Bengal lagged behind during 3 decades in the competitive world of India. So why a particular government went for this, again, strange experiment? Can you say something about it?
Nirmalda, I have no patience whatsoever with language chauvinism. I put it out there as among the sins with racism and xenophobia and all the other things which are inward instead of opening minds which close minds. So language chauvinism which promotes any one language, even if it's a state language, at the cost of other languages, to my mind seems not a very sensible and wise thing to do. You mentioned Bengal, but look at Maharashtra. They also had Marathi at the school level. State schools and even non-state schools, if I'm not wrong, had to teach Marathi in the school. So I think there can be a nice balance. In fact, scientific studies have actually shown that an infant's brain can take in more than one language. I mean, there is data, there is scientific studies to actually prove that there is no reason on earth why we must teach our children only one language. When they are very, very small, as parents, as teachers, as caretakers, I think we must expose them not only to more than one language, but more than one language culture. It seems to me that they have the ability at that very young age to learn more than one language. And that, in the longer run, will do them good, not harm.
Yeah, Professor U.R. Ananthamurthy used to often say that we are bilingual by nature.
Birth, yes.
By birth, by nature, we are all bilingual.
Like we can swim. I mean, we're supposed to know swimming by birth instinctively. So I think there is an instinct to pick up languages, which we suppress.
But one wonders, Meenakshi, as you said earlier that you have only one language, only English. So the questions which have come up till now, one wonders, is there some kind of a post-colonial baggage working here that we cannot do without English, but we tell ourselves don't love it?
I think in the case of India, English works better as a unifier than any other language because we're not like France or China where everyone just speaks one language. So I don't know whether you'd call it post-colonial or just a really convenient way to communicate with each other and at varied language. I mean, a lot of people here speak different languages and I'm able to get my point across because I'm speaking the single language.
Okay, so switching over to the translation, as it was earlier mentioned both by Radha and Rakshanda, that the translation is playing a very important role. And as you also mentioned that in unifying the country, linguistic unification of the country. Now, Rakshanda mentioned Karthika as she is sitting there and HarperCollins, but then along with HarperCollins, it seems quite a few publishing houses today are interested in publishing translation, which was not the case some 15 years back. So, as a result, demand on the translators and demand on the quality of translation has also increased. It cannot be now that just a dilettante, dabbling in 2 languages can translate from one language into another. A little of source language and target language will do. Now translation is quite a profession and very high quality is demanded of the translators. And as Radha mentioned earlier, the position of translators is also perhaps are coming up in the society. They are being recognized as some kind of creators also. And a lot of translation studies are here underway in different universities. Translation studies departments have been established, and a kind of new poetics of translation, an Indian poetics of translation is being sought to be evolved also, instead of depending only on the Western theories. So, what is your experience in translating Tagore, and what kind of apparatus or tool you use in your translation activities?
Yeah, translating Tagore has been for me a long engagement and a challenge that has really helped me grow in my understanding of literature and of languages and what they have to do with identity and with culture. Translating Tagore for me was a question of, first of all, thinking, who am I translating for? And you're talking about a change that has come about in the publishing marketplace, as it were, regarding attitudes towards translation. In part, I think it is because there is a growing readership in India as well as an international readership, so that if you are translating a writer like Tagore into English, you're really addressing a multiple readership, and the different expectations and backgrounds of those readerships do pose the question of how do you write something that will mean something to a range of different readers. Are you going to, in a sense, make the translation so smooth and easy to read that even someone very remote from your own world and culture will find it easy reading? Or are you going to keep it so close to your own culture that readers will stumble all the time over words and cultural terms for which there are no equivalents in English? And for these, there are no formulae. I found that I had to find my own ways around these issues, these specific textual problems. I had to strategize and keep in mind a certain kind of balance that would make the translation read as a text in its own right, which made me think also about the relationship between the translation and the original, and what does faithfulness mean in the field of translation? Does it mean you translate in a literal way, or is it about communicating the spirit of the original work to your readers? So as I said, this was a learning process where you are not just converting something from one language to another mechanically, but you are bringing a text to life in another language within another cultural setting. And this involves an element of interpretation, it involves an element of self-engagement, as it were, all of which I think reflect in the way I write, where very often when I come across terms for which you don't have English equivalents, kinship terms, we don't say aunt and uncle, we have a separate term for every kind of aunt and every kind of uncle, for instance, or names of seasons or types of food and clothing. Very often one now has the confidence to retain the Indian terms and most of the time minimize glossaries and explanations and allow the context to reveal to the reader a sense of what these terms mean, or in some way strategize so that the language evokes what you're trying to communicate. And even if you're not communicating everything 100%, let some aspects of the text remain mysterious, because that's also an aspect of literature that can draw the reader in. These are things one has learned along the way, but what one has learned most of all in the process of working with translations is that they serve not just a literary purpose, not just a textual purpose. Translation is really about human contact and communication. Translation is a contact zone, not just between the writer and translator, not just between the source text and the translation, but between to geographies, to histories, to cultures, to languages. And I think that is the place that it occupies in today's world.
Do you like to add something to it?
Well, about translations, Radha made some incredible points, all of them true, that, there is, we have as translators, we are more assured, we are learning to allow large parts of the original's feeling and sensibility remain. We want to use terms that are used, like you said, for uncle and aunt. In most Indian languages, there are different, there's chaya, taya and chacha and mosa and so on. And as translators, we want to retain that. That is the simple part. We also want to retain emotions and feelings. The scent of rain on dry ground, on parched land, that is something which is very evocative as an image. We want to retain that. We don't want to explain why it's important. We just want to let it be. The sehre ki ladiyan, the rosebuds that cover a groom's face, we want to retain the word sehra and maybe put the meaning elsewhere, but we want that to stay. We don't want to say strings of rose covering a groom's face. It seems convoluted, it seems clumsy. So we want to retain large parts of our original language, bits and pieces in our translation. And I think that is because we want to not make it idiot-proof. I think as translators, we are opening a window. Our job is to open a window. And if the reader finds the view through that window sufficiently interesting, then that translator can walk in through that. There is an analogy that is often used for translations. It's a very sexist analogy and a not very nice one. It is said that a translation is like a woman, if beautiful, not faithful, and if faithful, not beautiful. That's a bit offensive, quite offensive actually. So I would rather that the translations are like transfers. Not mechanical like bank transfers with service charges and so on, but yes, they are transfers from one language sensibility to another. But for me, what I've learned in these 25 years working with translations is that loss is inevitable. Maybe in sister languages or similar languages like, let's say, Urdu and Hindi, you can get away with changing the script, lipi antar as it's called, and maybe putting in a word or two as a footnote and get away with it because the syntax is similar, large parts of the vocabulary, the dhacha, the structure of the language is similar. But in languages as disparate as, let's say, Hindi, Urdu and English, what do? There, I think there is a certain amount of loss. And as a translator, the one thing that you work on is that that loss is inevitable. But the inevitability of that loss should not stop you from translating. So we work on the assumption that we are going to lose something. But then we also try and keep in mind what we are gaining. And what we are gaining is not just an audience and not just books sold and not just all of that in pure publishing terms. What we are gaining is we are holding somebody by the hand and taking them into another world and showing them that world. If they like that world, they can read more. So I think that, to my mind, is a big gain.
Yeah, Dr. Sujit Mukherjee, in his book, Translation as Discovery, said that if there is a loss involved, there is a renewal also. So the reduction is compensated by the renewal, which the translator brings in. I think we have another 5-6 minutes left. So at this point, one would like to open the discussion to the audience. If anyone has any question, general question or any pointed question to any of the panelists, you are welcome.
Nirmalda, if you permit, I'd like to just make an observation.
Sure.
You know, we use these words very loosely and toss them around, Pinglish and Tinglish and Bonglish and Hinglish. And I think these are slightly offensive because in a country this size, we have our multiple cultures, we have a lot of diversity in terms of not just the languages spoken. So why should we embrace English in the same way? There is no reason on earth why, when Macaulay came and laid down the minutes, why they should have been embraced in a sort of a monochromatic way across the length and breadth of the country. So Tinglish and Pinglish is all very well if it's used as a joke, but I don't think it should be taken very seriously, because as a people, the country this size, of course there will be variations, and those variations should be accepted. And it just shows the breadth and the reach of English in the nooks and crannies of the country.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, please.
I got two questions. The first question is that people who speak English, are they smarter than those people speaking in regional language? How far it is justified? Number one. Number two, in course of our discussion, you were telling that English is the only language of intellectual growth. Don't you feel that Sanskrit, being a mother language of all languages, don't you feel that Sanskrit also has got its weightage as an intellectual growth?
Who is this question addressed to?
I don't think any panelist was implying that English is the only language of intellectual growth. I think what we were saying is that there is a perception.
I think I mentioned it at the beginning.
So you mentioned it.
I was just referring to what Rajarao said. Rajarao mentioned that English, though we use the word alien as an adjective to English, but it is not actually alien. It has become a part of our intellectual growth. I think he was perfectly within his right to say so, because that is not in exclusion to Sanskrit or any other language. He was only talking about English at that point of time. Yeah, and the second question?
I think I also said that English, and I used it regretfully, that for me
Yeah.
English is a language of intellectual discourse and not the two other languages I know, which are Hindi and Urdu. And I said that with regret. I wish it weren't so. So not for a minute were any of us suggesting that it's not possible to have intellectual discourse in other languages.
Yes.
The second question I was asking, people who speak English, are they smarter than those people speaking in regional language? How far is justified? Or is it true or fact?
That's, to my mind, an absurd question.
Yeah.
Good evening to all the panelists sitting there. My question is, as for your discussion, the English language has been Indianized. But do you think the Roman script, Roman English has been Indianized? How far the Roman language has been Indianized? Anyone of you?
I don't get the question. There is no Roman language here.
Roman script.
Mm-hmm.
The way we write in English, we write it in Hindi also.
Yeah,
So-
we are speaking generally in terms of the position of English in India, and beginning from historical compulsion, and as Dr. Radha Chakraborty pointed out, or Rakshanda perhaps pointed out, that whatever Macaulay's minutes might have been, whatever might have been the original intention in introducing English in India, today English is being used in a totally different context. So far as script is concerned, how can you Indianize the script? You cannot. But the Roman script is being used in India in many states where script is not there. You go to the northeast, in Nagaland, in Mizoram, in Meghalaya, the script of Khasi language is Roman script. In Nagaland, script of Tinedi or Ao is Roman script. In Mizoram, it is Roman script. So these are certain, objective conditions of the society which dictate these terms. Saantali had Bengali script, Odia script, and also Hindi script. And now their own script, which is called Alchi. So these are complicated issues, and you cannot just Indianize Roman script. Thank you. Anyone else?
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for your. I'm here.
Oh, that corner.
Thanks for your insights and sharing your experience. My question is with reference to the Dalit example that Sir gave in the starting, and also the information that you shared that any infant is by nature scientifically proved that it can be taught, it can be bilingual. I want some of your comments on the attitude the parents should have while parenting for a child's upbringing at the age of like 2, 3, or 4 years. What we generally see, it's like kind of conditioned. Even parents who are not very good at English, sometimes just because it kind of commands the dignity and respect in front of others, they would speak with the child more like, what is your name? Any neighbor would come and he would ask the child of 2 years and he would say, what is your name? Ye nahi puchenge tumhara naam kya hai, or in the language. So this happens right from the very young age of 2, 3 years. Like even grandfathers, they will say, come, they won't say in regional language. That's one. So I want to also share an experience I had in a restaurant, which was kind of a moment of growth for myself. We were in this 5-star restaurant, and I had a very little cousin with me. She was 3 or 4 years old. And there was another Russian family there next to us. So, and they also had a very little baby there, same age, almost 4, 5 years, 3, 4 years. So my little cousin, she went to the Russian girl, and she...
you have to be brief,
Yeah, I just want to share this and then your comments on parenting. She asked, what is your name? And very politely, the parents say, she doesn't know English. So that time, we had a discussion. If the same thing would have happened with an Indian family, we would have instantly judged that, okay, at 4 or 5 years, the parents, and they don't know English. So I want some of your comments on what is the importance of English in terms of dignity, and what is the importance of English just to reach out to people like a Ling language.
Can I share my personal experience as a parent?
Okay.
Well, this is not a professional opinion, but as a parent, my children would only speak Urdu till they were 4, and that made things a little difficult when they started school, because they knew virtually no English. But I don't think it did them any harm in the long run. I mean, they picked up as they went along. Yes, when they went for the interview, they were a bit blank. When they were trying to make friends, they were a bit blank. When they played with kids in the play school, they were a little sort of lost. But I don't think it did them any major harm.
But I think your point is very well taken. It does not really have a direct reply. Just like that, we cannot solve the issue. But your point is well taken. Thank you for your comments. And it remains for me to thank actually the compeer is breathing down my neck. So it remains for me to thank my co-panelists and for the interesting points they have made, and also to thank all of you for your patience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. May I request Mr. Chawla to please join us on stage and present small tokens of appreciation to all the panelists and to the chairman. We must thank the panelists for sharing their views and opinions. And special thanks to the chairman for excellently chairing and moderating this session, adding his own insights. I'll request all to kindly pose for a special photograph. We would like to freeze special moments so that we will cherish the memories for years to come. Thank you once again to the chairman and all speakers.